As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Ukraine begins firing U.S. cluster bombs. So Ukrainian officials told the Washington Post on Thursday that Ukrainian forces have started firing U.S.-provided cluster munitions at Russian soldiers in southeastern Ukraine, and this was later confirmed by the White House. So last year, the White House called the use of cluster bombs in Ukraine a potential war crime, but President Biden signed off on the delivery of the civilian-killing munitions earlier this month. As I've covered it quite a bit, cluster bombs are so hazardous to civilians because they spread small submunitions over large areas, and the submunitions that don't explode immediately on impact can kill or maim civilians for decades to come. We're still seeing that in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. In some of those countries, they say it'll take 100 years to clean them all up. So according to the Washington Post, by sending the bombs to Ukraine, President Biden bypassed U.S. law that prohibits the production, use, or transfer of cluster munitions with a dud rate of more than 1%. The dud rate refers to the percentage of these submunitions, or bomblets as they call them, that don't explode. So the Pentagon is claiming that the munitions they are sending to Ukraine have a dud rate of 2.35%, which is higher than 1%. However, that's probably not true. The New York Times reported that the rate will likely be 14%. It could even be higher. Basically, what they're saying is that the Pentagon tests don't take into account the conditions on the battlefield. You know, if the ground is soft, they're less likely to explode, things like that, factors like that. Next one here, Congress sets up a battle over Taiwan military aid. So the House and the Senate are set up for a fight over how much military aid to include for Taiwan in 2024 spending bills, as each chamber's appropriations committees granted a different amount. So the Senate Appropriations Committee on Thursday passed its 2024 State Department and Foreign Aid spending bill that includes $113 million in foreign military financing grants for Taiwan. The House Appropriations Committee's version of the bill includes $500 million in foreign military financing, FMF grants for Taiwan. So that's a few $100 million more that the Republican-led House is trying to give Taiwan. And FMF is a State Department program that gives foreign governments money to buy U.S.-made arms. The 2023 National Defense Authorization Act included $2 billion in FMF for Taiwan, but congressional appropriators only approved the funds as loans that needed to be paid back. So this gets a little confusing. So the 2023 NDAA is the one that they passed and signed last year. And, they put $2 billion for Taiwan in there, but then when it came to appropriations, which actually, makes the funds available to fulfill the NDAA, the appropriators only put that in as loans, which is because they were worried about cutting the State Department budget in other areas. And as far as I know, those loans haven't been used. I haven't seen any announcements from the State Department that they were loaning Taiwan money to buy weapons. But this, what they're trying to put in for next year is, grants that they're going to give to Taiwan. All right, the next one here, the House kills effort to end emergency war powers. So this article is from Alexander Rubinstein over at the Gray Zone. And it says that in a massive show of support for limitless executive power, Congress rejected legislation that would have terminated national emergency powers, allowing Washington to wage war across the Middle East and to test biological weapons on U.S. citizens. Well, that doesn't sound good. So this was led by Representative Paul Gosar. I believe he's a Republican from Arizona. A handful of Republican members of Congress launched a protest against 41 nominal national emergency declarations, many of which are decades old. So Rep. Gosar has argued that the National Emergencies Act is tyrannical, granting 148 separate powers to the executive branch. On July 18th, which was Tuesday, the House voted down 5 resolutions to terminate national emergency powers, which date back as far as 2003. So they voted on these emergency powers that affect Congo, Yemen, Libya, Syria, and Iraq. Each vote saw a coalition of pro-war Democrats and Republicans join together in overwhelming numbers to protect the executive branch's emergency authorities. I believe only a few dozen Republicans voted to get rid of these emergency declarations. And these things allow the U.S. to sanction countries. These specific examples, there's one to sanction Syria that started in 2004, one to sanction the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there's also this emergency act on Libya, and it's on the basis that Muammar Gaddafi poses a threat to the U.S., and he's long dead, but they still renew these emergency powers, these emergency, resolutions, whatever they call them, using Gaddafi as the reason. U.S. launches airstrike in Somalia, says 5 killed. So U.S. Africa Command on Thursday said that it launched an airstrike in Somalia in support of the Mogadishu-based government forces who were engaged with al-Shabaab on the ground. So AFRICOM said the strike was launched in a remote area about 9 miles south of the village of Galkad in Somalia's central Galgudud region, near the border of the Middle Shabelle region. The area is about 150 miles northeast of Mogadishu, so it's like lower central Somalia. So the AFRICOM claimed that its initial assessment found the strike killed 5 al-Shabaab fighters and claimed that no civilians were harmed. We always have to keep in mind that the Pentagon is notorious for undercounting civilian casualties. AFRICOM did not say what day the strike was launched, but the Mogadishu-based government said that its ground forces, the Somali National Army, launched a joint military operation with the U.S. in the same area on Wednesday. The Somali Information Ministry claimed that 100 al-Shabaab fighters were killed in the fighting. And it's not clear if there was U.S. troops on the ground involved in this. There's, as far as we know, 500 U.S. troops. Although when Congress was debating Gates' resolution to withdraw from Somalia, they were saying there's 900 troops there. So President Joe Biden has admonished Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to cease his attempts to ram through his coalition's controversial judicial overhaul amid mass opposition protests. He recommends instead that the Israeli leaders seek a broad consensus. Following a meeting with Israeli President Isaac Herzog, Biden told New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman that if a more democratic path is not taken, Washington's special relationship with Tel Aviv could be affected. So while still facing a corruption trial since coming to power last December, Netanyahu's coalition, made up of Likud, far-right, and ultra-Orthodox parties, has attempted to give the Knesset the power to override the Israeli Supreme Court decisions with a simple majority vote. The plan also calls for de facto control regarding court nominees. I believe Netanyahu has said that he'd be willing to get rid of the, overriding the Knesset simple majority, overriding the Supreme Court decisions.
Here's Gerald Celente with today's trends in the news.
So now the dollar is only strong because interest rates are high. When interest rates go down, the dollar goes down. And it's going to be the beginning of the death of the dollar because the BRICS and other countries not involved with them but want to get in with the whole deal, they're tired of America's economic and geopolitical hegemony. So they're going to be going for gold, backed by gold. So the lower the dollar goes, the higher gold prices go because the other currencies get strong and gold is dollar-based. So as the dollar gets weaker, it costs them less dough to buy more gold. And already you're seeing what the central banks are buying it up. In the first quarter, it was 155% bigger than last year's. And last year's quarter at the same time. And for last year was the biggest ever in central banks buying gold. So that's what you're looking at. Again, the numbers are here. The World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization. Who are they? A bunch of fucking scumbags. That's who they are. They called it a pandemic on March 11th. Look it up. 2020, when out of 114 countries, there are about 8 billion people in the world. 114 countries, the grand total, 4,291 deaths of COVID. And these deaths are now being reported as they didn't die of COVID. So if you take a third of that away, or 30%, yeah. And they called it a pandemic, and people are still calling it a pandemic. So going back to this article, Canada is currently grappling with significant economic issues, market concentration, a select few corporations dominate key sectors, leading to reduced competition, rising prices, and limited purchase options for consumers. Yeah, no shit. It's been going on for fucking how long? And they make the state here. Canada's grocery industry is a prime example. A recent report from Competition Bureau found that a lack of competition in grocery sector is resulting in higher food prices. Grocery industry is dominated by 5 major players: Loblaws, Metro, Empire, Walmart, and Costco. These 5 companies account for over 3/4 of all food sales in Canada. On to the Ukraine war. As you know, the Ukrainians blew up the Crimea Bridge again. In retaliation, the Russians increased their attack into Ukraine. But this is the headline of the toilet paper record, the New York Slime. Russia strikes Ukraine port as grain deal is suspended. Didn't have a fucking thing to do with the grain deal, because then you read down into the article. Explosions thundered over Odessa, Ukraine, as Russia targeted it with missiles and drones before dawn on Tuesday, a day after the apparent Ukrainian strike damage to an important Russian bridge. Yeah. Oh, and the Kremlin halted a deal for safe passage of grain. No. blowing up the bridge. But that gives you the propaganda, and that's what we don't do. We give you the facts and give you our analysis and our trend forecasts. Hey, how about this for stupidity? How about this for fucking stupid fucking shit that morons and imbeciles swallow? UK Foreign Secretary warns the West, quote, not to drop the ball in Ukraine war. Yep, not to drop the ball. Hey, ballless, go over there and fucking fight or shut your fucking mouth. We've got to respond that if we drop the ball on this, if we allow Putin to win, the pain that we're experiencing at the moment economically will pale into insignificance. James stupidly cleverly, told the Wall Street Journal. Buried into the article, it said that the official number of COVID-19 deaths is probably an exaggeration. This is a quote, because it includes some people who had the virus when they died, even though it was not the underlying cause of death. No fucking shit. No fucking shit. Only been saying this for over 3 years. But now the New York Times and the CDC admitted to it, and even that number is low. Yep. Dumb enough to believe Bush's war, dumb enough to believe the COVID war. An admission that COVID deaths were overcounted by 30%, according to the CDC. And Fauci, that little fraud, that arrogant little fuckface Fauci, told NBC in 2020, quote, there is absolutely no evidence that that's the case at all, when he was asked about the suggestion that the death toll was being artificially padded. Meanwhile, motorcycle crash victims, gunshot victims, and other unrelated deaths were found to have added to the total. Italy recalculated its own COVID mortality figures in 2021, revealing that just 2.9% of the pandemic deaths could be exclusively attributed to the virus. The remainder had at least one chronic disease, often several, though fact checkers were quick to counter any claims that these comorbidities, not the virus, were responsible for the patient's demise. And it goes on. So again, bullshit. That's all they sell. Today's front page of the Wall Street Journal. America is becoming a nation of early birds. Dinner parties at 5 p.m. Consumers of all ages are sliding activities back. The damage the COVID war has done is incalculable. Again, when I was a kid, they used to have these ads. It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are? We're out all the time. Where were you? And now, 10 o'clock, the streets are dead. This thing has changed people so dramatically. Anyway.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
And I think we've all kind of had a sense that this was a problem because, of course, we've heard things about Social Security is going to become a problem and Medicare is going to become a problem. There are going to be huge expenses and bills coming due. But one of the reasons that these programs are not sustainable is not just that they're going to be big bills. It's that there are going to be fewer people to pay the bills. That's really the issue. So I realize that the numbers are different in different parts of the world, but try to give us some kind of a sense of the scope of the problem. Because I think qualitatively, people understand that maybe there's been some kind of demographic shift in terms of births, but they may not know exactly the full scope of what we're looking at here.
Yeah, so in terms of, we could talk in depth about the economic consequences of this, but just in terms of the raw numbers and the consequences it's going to have on demographics, Korea right now has a 0.78 total fertility rate, meaning that under current conditions, if those conditions were to hold throughout a woman's lifetime, the number of kids she would end up having is 0.78, so less than one child per woman. And the way that cashes out from a generational perspective is that for every 100 living Koreans, there will be 6 great-grandchildren, which is, that's not comparable to the smallpox epidemics in the New World. It's not comparable to the Black Death. It's the most dramatic and drastic population collapse maybe in human history. And it's going to happen over 3 generations. That's Korea. Japan is a little bit ahead of them. I think their fertility rate is like 1 point something. It's very, very low. And so that means maybe 9 or 10 great-grandchildren. Europe and the US are very similar in terms of their native-born population. They're helped economically, I guess that's debatable, but they're helped in terms of the statistics by migration. And so we are all in this situation where, and it's worldwide, and in the West, it's the most mature and it's the most intense at this moment. But if you look at the drift of fertility rates across the world, including Africa, including Latin America, including India and Pakistan, all these places that we think of as like very, very populous, very, very fertile, all of their TFRs, all of their fertility rates are dropping like a rock to the point that by 2030, the only region of the world that will have positive population growth on Earth is sub-Saharan Africa. And by the end of this century, they will have fallen below replacement fertility as well. So you can look at it from the cultural and personal perspective. It's just millions and millions of people who will be deprived of this very fundamental human experience. But from an economic perspective, the consequences are going to be absolutely devastating. I mean, you look at Detroit and what essentially happened to Detroit. You could talk about the reasons why everybody abandoned Detroit. That's a broader sort of policy conversation. But like ultimately, the way Detroit collapsed was the tax base abandoned it. The tax base left. And so you had just tens of thousands of vacant homes that had been abandoned. You had people scattered across this sort of wasteland. And like abandoned homes don't keep. They fall apart and they get mold and they get stripped for the copper and the aluminum. And so even the people who chose to stay, the value of their homes collapsed, partly because they were surrounded by urban and suburban blight, but also because all of our homes and our 401ks and Social Security and Medicare, all of the models that give us the sense of like what your home is worth, what your 401k is worth, those are all predicated on reliable economic growth, including population growth. And I'll stop in just a second, but like there's only two ways an economy can grow, right? You can get more efficient, more productive per worker, or you can get more workers. And currently we're in a situation where productivity per worker is growing. It's sort of leveling off, tapering, stagnating, but the number of workers is about to drop like a rock. And so if these circumstances continue, if this demographic collapse transpires the way it looks like it's going to, you will not be able to count on reliable economic growth anywhere in the Western world. So the US, I think, is at 1.6, 1.7 TFR, which is not replacement. That's a declining population.
Now, is replacement 2.1?
2.1 is replacement. And it's not only declining in terms of absolute numbers, it's declining in terms of its aging. And as a population ages, it's not just that there are more dependents, it's that the dependents per person become more costly. Massive healthcare expenses and living expenses. And so what will transpire by the end of the century is that for every working age family, every working age couple trying to raise kids and iterate and build, there are going to be 4 adult dependents, which currently the ratio is inverted. For every working age family, there's 1 adult dependent in the system. And so it's not a problem that like, oh, the population will get smaller. Like a lot of people compare this to wildlife populations. Say, the population crashes and then it sort of rebuilds. It's like, there's probably some point at which it equilibrates, but we have no idea where that is, because the harder it gets to have children and the more that burden falls on a smaller cohort, the harder it will be for that smaller cohort to sort of clear the economic hurdles that are required to start a family. So this thing is on a positive feedback loop. It's getting worse as it gets worse. And yeah, to directly address the immigration question, it's like Mexico's below replacement fertility. Guatemala is just at replacement fertility and dropping like a rock. All of Latin America by 2030 will be below replacement fertility. And immigrants inside the US, their fertility rate is 2.0. So almost at sustainable levels, but not at replacement. And so I've said the problem with socialism is you run out of other people's money. The problem with this is you run out of other people's kids. That's sort of the policy band-aid that every sort of polite, right-thinking Western government has proposed. Like, well, we'll just bring in new people. And it's like, even if you stipulate that you like don't care about the Americans who live here and like you don't value them any differently than you value anybody else, which that's not my perspective. But even if that's the case, that will not solve this economic problem. Kinds of things that we're going to be looking for. Also, infrastructure failure. Like we saw in Detroit with the water in Flint, Michigan. A lot of that is just the fact that the number of people to maintain the machines, and I don't mean like water treatment experts necessarily, although that's part of it. I mean the tax base. The young working population that pays the bills for the infrastructure, as that dwindled, there just wasn't the budget to maintain, because you're pumping water, you're pumping sewer, you're pumping electricity through this city that used to be enormous, and you're pumping it to like one guy on this street and one family on that street, and it stops making economic sense. And so the value of those properties collapses. People's retirement, the majority of middle-class families, they have like 70% of their net worth in their homes. And as those values collapse, it's sort of not a simple thing to be middle-aged or elderly and to have to leave your home and to have that home be like worth nothing, essentially, to be wiped out, especially as people increasingly have these homes on long mortgages with high interest rates. Yeah, so it's essentially, you're looking at a really serious economic problem where probably Gen X is going to be the first that gets hit with this, where Social Security becomes insolvent, reliable economic growth has collapsed, meaning that home values in a lot of states will also have collapsed. 401ks will have fallen quite a lot. And it's like, what do you do at that point? It's not obvious there's a ton you can do. It's just people becoming dramatically poorer in our lifetime.
You're listening to Part of the
I just don't agree with your facts, which began with the presentation of one of the most outrageously persistent lies that I hear, which is this private jet. We don't own a private jet. I don't own a private jet. I personally have never owned a private jet. And obviously, it's pretty stupid to talk about coming in a private jet from the State Department up here. It just, honestly, if that's where you want to go, go there.
A few moments later. You just testified under oath that you never owned a private jet. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record article here from February 15th, 2023. The John Kerry family private jet was sold shortly after accusations of climate hypocrisy. Mr. Secretary, do you stand by that testimony that you've never owned, or
I personally,
your family?
I personally, yes, my wife owned a plane.
It's not just the double standard, I think, is what is at the heart of it. On top of that, it's the fact that you have these people who are like, a person like John Kerry is just so, what an ability to just completely be a cold-blooded liar. You know, to look at you right in the eyes and go, this is just an outrageous lie that I've never owned a private jet. I don't own a private jet. I didn't fly on a private jet. I don't know what you're talking about. And you're like, but it says here that your family owns a private jet. He goes, yeah, my wife owns a private jet. Sure. But like that, I don't know. That's her thing. Yeah. Have I flown on my wife's private jet? Sure. Lots of times. But it's like, wait, what? You know, this kind of double standard of where, it's right at the heart of the whole climate change insanity is, oh, look, the climate change is such a disaster that we have to tackle this. Now, what do we have to do in order to tackle this? Well, every single policy prescription is that the little guy's got to suffer. Every policy prescription is like, we have to have a tax on gasoline. We have to ban the car that you like to drive. We have to ban the stove that you like to cook on. You can't drink out of a plastic straw anymore. You got to drink out of a paper straw.
You have to buy credits for what was free from me now. Yes. If you want to consume air, you're now going to have to purchase it from me. I'm the only person you can purchase it from. Yep. And unless you're purchasing what used to be free from me, we can't continue as a species.
Yeah, you may not be able to have a hamburger anymore. You may not be, like, every single proposal is something that's going to make the average working class guy's life harder. And meanwhile, they're not even, look, even if you're saying, let's say it's John Kerry's wife, and she's the one flying around. Well, hey, shouldn't you be like putting some pressure on your wife to not be flying private? I thought carbon emissions are like your big issue that you care so much about. No. They don't need to do any of that. It's the same thing as like these socialists who are multimillionaires, you know, want to talk about how awful income inequality is, but they have no interest in like just doing something where they could actually close the gap in terms of income inequality and affect some real person's life by giving them a bunch of your money. They don't know that we don't want to do that. And this is true on so many different issues across the board. So many issues. Of course, this was on full display during COVID, where you would see all of these people, whether it's Nancy Pelosi or Dianne Feinstein or Gavin Newsom or any of them who are the advocates of everyone's got to mask up. But then we all see pictures of you not masking up. Oh, you can't have dinner indoors, but then you're having dinner indoors. And you had AOC, what was it, at that gala event where she's literally sitting there and they're all not in a mask and all the servants are in masks? You know, it's just this like constant thing. And it's pervasive throughout so many policies. You know, it's like the people who live in gated communities will explain to you why you don't need a wall between Mexico and the United States of America. The people with armed security will tell you why we need gun control. You know, it's like over and over and over again. They literally, they advocate policies that destroy public schools while they send their own kids to private schools. So it's constantly advocating these policies that you will suffer from, that they are completely immune to, because they're outside of the system of these policies. Like, it doesn't apply to them. So they're constantly demanding that you sacrifice. But not only that, if you don't agree that you should suffer while they are above these policies that they push, they demonize you in the most vicious ways. You know, if you're like, hey, I think we should build a wall because we can't just have hundreds of thousands of migrants crossing over the border every month. They're like, whoa, you're a horrific racist. And let me go back to my Beverly Hills mansion in a gated community. If you know, while they have armed security around them, if you're like, well, I think I have a right to have whatever weapon I want to protect me and my family, they're like, oh, I guess you just don't care when kids get shot up in a school. You know, like at every turn, you're demonized in the most vicious way for opposing the thing that they don't suffer at all. They don't suffer. The parents who go down to yell at the school board officials because they're like propagandizing their children in public school, they get called terrorists by the parents of people who send their kids to private schools. Like, it's really, it's unbelievable. It's a powerful plan for the elites. It much in the same way that COVID was. It's, you know, they really enjoy these enemies being things that are very untangible, like abstractions You know, if your enemy,
Sorry, hold on. That's an error. I was trying to look something up.
no problem.
You're good. You're good.
You know, if your enemy is, let's say, the German military or something like that, well, then there can at least be a strategy to defeat this very tangible thing. You know, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have an offensive from this angle. We're going to have, missiles drop over here. We're going to have an air campaign. Okay, you could take them out and then declare victory and then be done. And this is a major part of the reason why after 9/11, we didn't just go to war with Al-Qaeda or go to war with even Iraq or the Taliban. We went to war with terror because that war can go on forever. That's like a blank check to just, you give me all the money and power for whatever I say is the next thing. This is why they love, wars on inequality. Isn't that nice? Inequality. If people aren't equal, we're against it. Well, you're going to have a lot of battles to fight in that campaign.
Now the gimmick we want to talk about is BlackRock. BlackRock is big-time business, and that's Larry Fink's little pet project. And he's been around a while. Back in 1986, he was involved in investments, and he didn't do so well back then. Back then, when a dollar was a real dollar, he lost $100 million in a year. So he was never perfect in his investments. And yet he was selected, I believe, and endorsed by the officials and the deep state to manage money for the big guys, for the governments, state governments, and big corporations and all. And he became the largest in the world. He probably is close to it now. $10 trillion he's been able to manage. This is pretty amazing. But I feared that from the very beginning because he was promising to invest in ESG, environment, social, and governmental activities to appeal to the progressives and be morally correct on how your investment goes. And they had ways of threatening people if they didn't do it. So it was a coercive measure. And I thought there's enough malinvestment to go around just with the artificial interest rates we have at business and consumer trying to figure out what to do with a guide from the interest rates. Well, they did big, but there was news. Of course, Chris has looked at this, and that is this past week there was some news coming out that maybe BlackRock is not doing so well. But there's been hints of that all along. The system was flawed from the beginning. But I think this week, Chris, there's been a few things that indicates that they might be in serious trouble, and you combine that with the already built-in malinvestment from inflating the currency and all the things that we've done in the last 10 years. That's why I think the bubble is big and the bubble is bursting. Chris.
Yes, Dr. Paul, it is good news. We're talking about the market, how the market cannot be defeated. It cannot be overpowered in the long term. Now, what exactly is the market? Well, it's very simple. It's billions and billions of individual decisions that we each make every single day at all moments. Like right now, we always choose. I value this over this. I value this over this. Right now, I value speaking to our audience more than anything else I could be doing right now. And this is what 7 billion people do all the time. We're constantly, I value this more than $10. I value $10 more than this. So that's what the market is. That's why it's so powerful and cannot be overturned. But there are always the few that have a problem with this. They say, no, you're going to value what I tell you to value. And that's the authoritarians, all the utopians, all the busybodies, the central planners. And they try to manipulate the market. And they can distort the market, they can manipulate it, but it's always temporary. It's always a fool's errand because in the end, the market always overpowers them. It smashes their schemes. And this has been done throughout all time by kings, by oligarchies, by democracies, by totalitarians. They all try to say, no, you're going to value what we say you're going to value. And they're always doomed to failure. So that's, BlackRock is just yet another example. They came up with this ESG scheme, this environmental, social, and governance, and now they're backtracking. They even put an oil guy, the Saudi oil CEO, on their board. And they said that, what Ron DeSantis did in Florida by pulling their money out of BlackRock and all the decisions that have been made by these, by people boycotting these woke corporations. This is all an agenda that's trying to be pushed into a market, and the market is saying no. So finally, BlackRock is now starting to at least, go backwards. I'm sure they're still committed to their scheme, but the market is overpowering them and will win in the end, because our economy is filled with political malinvestments. And you can even tell by the way that they think. Oh, by 2050, Everybody's going to be driving electric car. I mean, this is how you try to force your ideas on everyone. Anybody can make predictions about 2050. That's so far away that it's ridiculous, but that's how they get their PR, and they push this stuff and they push it. So it's going to have to be liquidated, and that's not going to be fun. And the government's going to blame all the wrong people. They're not going to blame themselves. So everybody has to be alert. It's not going to be who they blame. It's not the greedy businessman who's raising prices. It's the Fed that printed all the money and the government that spent all the money that they didn't have. And now it's going to be time to pay the piper.
You know, they always have to make it sound good to get people to go along, then scare people. You know, in national security or viruses are coming, scare the people so that they capitulate. They might not have a good feeling about it, but it is serious and we can't defy our government. And they do roll over and go along exactly with what they tell you. In medicine, it's safety. That's why you have to get these shots. Now the evidence is coming out. That's not a very healthy thing to have done, to give the shots to as many people. And now if you even go and look at the statistics now showing of the damage done by the inoculations and how risky it was, I mean, it's still a serious crime. In a way, people saying for challenging science, challenging Dr. Fauci, this kind of nonsense. Now, on this investment, it used the issue of virtue, because you're a virtuous person if you were even including in your investments to do what was right for saving the planet, taking on climate control. And this is the way to do it. You can invest the money and make a lot of money. A lot of people made a lot of money because they realized how powerful the forces were. And the punishment was that if you didn't go along, you could get your business in big trouble. So it was a pragmatic business decision then, and probably less so now, where they had to do it because they didn't want this punishment. But it was always a virtuous thing, and you were supposed to feel good about it because you were saving the planet. But that's why we have to be always aware of what they're telling us. And to me, it's the eternal effort to seek out the truth from fiction. And this is a big problem, and it seems to be at the worst that I ever remember. And we certainly are hearing what's going on in the campaign at the present time, that people have a real job figuring out who's telling the truth and who's lying, what TV station can you contribute, or maybe you should use the internet and some special sources of information as the best way to find out what's going on. Chris?
Very good, Dr. Paul. I will finish up with my closing statement. And it's something that I've mentioned on the show before, but it's so important that I'm going to repeat myself. The U.S. government is the biggest polluter on earth via the military empire. Now there's people who say, no, it's China, it's China. Whatever. If it's China and then the U.S. military, that's not the point. The point is our government. Think about that. The government is the biggest polluter on the earth, or second, whatever. And they are not changing that. And when we're so saturated with environmental propaganda, do you get that sense when you hear the propaganda that it's the government itself? No, they say it's you. It's your plastic straws. It's your plastic bags that you use. You're the problem. You're the CO2 person, you know? And so do you see, they're the big polluter, yet they come after us and try to micromanage our lives with their, agenda. And they have no, this is another important point, they have no inclination of changing this. Have you seen bases changed? Have you seen the war stop? Have the troops come home? If there was a crisis and they're the biggest polluter with the military, shouldn't the troops be coming home? We only have a few years to live. Bring them all home. No, it's the opposite. They think they're going to fight Russia and China at the same time and defend every country that goes along with, with America. So they obviously do not believe their own propaganda because their actions signify that they don't believe the propaganda. So why should we believe it? Why should we have to alter our lives and have carbon scores when they're the problem and not us? So it's important for everybody to keep this in mind because the propaganda hits us every single day, from the television to the movies to everybody, to all the protesters that want no oil. It's all goofy stuff, and we have to keep an eye that they're the ones that are the problem and not us.
Wow. What happens is the debt gets liquidated and the economy gets weak and it's forced upon us, which is the kind of thing that should be avoided. But once you develop this huge bubble, they say that Larry Fink has had a true change of heart on what he's doing. Just changing it. If you have $10 trillion you're dealing with, you say, oh, sorry, folks, we missed the boat. We'll come back and do this later. A lot of ramifications from that. But that is the unwinding of the mistakes made and the debt. The debt is not going to be paid off in a moral, sensible way. It will be by the market, by just saying it'll be paid off by money with so much less value through the debasement of the currency. So I think recognizing that and recognizing that the solution is not difficult, it's easily understood, it doesn't have to be prolonged for years. What we're doing now, tinkering around the edges, makes it last longer and longer and more serious. But when you allow the correction to come, and the people who literally have to get out of this with a declaration of debt. I mean, have they really solved the problem of student loans, even with the hundreds of billions of dollars that they have to default on to a degree, and it's a back and forth? It's going to linger for a long time. But sound money and personal liberty and a free market economy, I'll tell you what, could go a long way to solving the problems that we have today. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today, and please return to the Liberty Report soon.